Why don't we start with Greece, because that's pretty topical. In particular today, I don't know if all of you caught the news that the politicians in Greece have effectively gone to the banks and said they want to have them change out all of their management and their boards, which is not necessarily consistent with some of the communications with Eurozone leaders in respect of their expectation that there was going to be a commercial aspect to the banking system. And they're saying that they want to do this because they want to foster lending to the small and medium enterprise world to jumpstart the economy, but some of that's tension-filled. What is remarkable, though, if you think about, in theory, what a Greek exit should mean in concept to the entire Eurozone sort of original construct, what I find fascinating, and it's obviously the lens that I look at the world with, is that the markets have largely sloughed off the prospect of the Greek exit. Now, a lot of that's due to monetary easing, but what I find just amazing is that the capital flows continue, the amount of investment that is coming into the European arena, both locally but more importantly from abroad. We are raising capital at unprecedentedly cheap rates in the debt markets right now. And that's indicative, I think, of how globalized our world is and how much liquidity there is in the world that can withstand some of these previously conceptual sort of exogenous shocks that in theory should have really frozen the markets. So maybe I'll start there.
Tony, let me ask you, 20 whatever years ago it was, there wasn't a single currency, but there was an exchange rate mechanism in Europe, and I remember that. That was pretty disorderly in 1991, yeah, 1992, absolutely. Including in the UK. Yeah. And you're optimistic that even though there's no treaty pathway for a Greek exit, Greece in, Greece out, everything will go okay in Europe?
Well, I would start by saying I'm probably the most negative in the firm on this topic. But I think Mervyn King said it very well when he said, never in the history of the world has there been a monetary union without political union. And I think the stresses are significant. I also think in the context of politics, you have a scenario where, the toughest thing a politician ever has to do is take things away from people, right? The easiest thing a politician can do is blame it on someone else. And I think we're seeing both of those occurring today. And as a result, one thing that's been consistent since the crisis is the market share gain of the Eurosceptic parties, whether they're on the left or the right. Our house view is that Greece stays in, but I would say I'm personally very concerned in the medium to long term that there will be a populist party that will pull the ripcord.
So Euroscepticism in the UK has been here since at least Margaret Thatcher. And both sides of politics now say they want to have a referendum on Britain's membership in the EU? Or is it only the Tories who want to do that?
Well, it's the Tories and UKIP. Labour's much more kind of, theoretically
but I mean, even Miliband has to acknowledge the scepticism. Should Britain stay in the EU, or does it matter one way or the other? I remember the economics. The economics said, and wasn't it Gordon Brown who said, I understand my optimal currency theory, and of course Britain shouldn't be in the euro, and it hasn't been. It's done fine. Does the market matter? What do you think is going to happen here? You're leaving, so you can now opine.
Well, okay. You got me way out of my comfort zone here. But I mean, my own view is that would be very negative for the market, very unexpected, and the market's certainly not pricing in that eventuality. So, my view is that England kind of has the best of all worlds, right? Because they don't have the currency, but they have the benefits of being part of the common market and some of the other kind of integration benefits that brings. So,
some people have conjectured that for young Europeans today, first of all, they don't think their lives will be as good as their parents' lives, and second, I've been trying to think about this. That's probably the first time since the Industrial Revolution that's been the case, when the next generation wasn't confident that their lives would be better than the prior generation. Tony, how do you? Again, we're in the UK now, and you're going back to New York. But how do you think about, what was it, Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney who talked about old Europe? How do you think about, how should we think about conventional Western Europe? Is it really a place that's going to be relegated to sort of cultural tourism, or is there a lot more life in the old dog yet?
Well, I personally think there are wonderful businesses here, still great education institutions. So I think there's a lot of potential in Europe. Certainly, we find a lot of great businesses that we want to own, and a number of great businesses that have a majority of their revenues overseas. So I don't think it's right at all to talk about writing off Europe, but I do think change is needed, and I do think structural reforms are needed. But all those things, I think, are within the realm of the possible. Clearly, with very high unemployment rates, particularly among youth, that's destabilizing to society. And so I think the clock is ticking in a sense that these structural reforms need to occur. And generally, when you implement a structural reform, the first thing is the economy shrinks a bit, right, before you start to get the benefit. So I don't know how much goodwill there is remaining to sort of get some of these reforms through, but I do think it's important. I do think it's possible.
So
Can
structure.
I pick up just for
Yes,
a second
please.
on the point that you made earlier about the public-private partnership? Because if you think about some of the countries in Europe, we do have this aging population, big problem.
Yep.
And you have the combination of the society getting older, but also everyone living longer. So, you know, the conventional wisdom now is each generation is going to live another 10 years beyond that ahead of it. So you have that double whammy of it getting older and everybody living longer, which puts huge stresses on the social system. So you take a country like Italy, which is, you know, on the higher end of that aging side of the spectrum, and 75% of the social government budget is going into aging healthcare. It's not going into education. It's not going into all these other things that are societal needs. So that is the negative view. The positive view for me is I believe absolutely in the power of human ingenuity. And when you have these big, big problems, you know, humans will rise to the occasion to solve them. And so I think what's going to end up happening is you're going to see a lot more of the private sector stepping in to solve some of these problems. I mean, we sit at a think tank whatever it was 3 or 4 weeks ago around Alzheimer's. And how are we going to tackle this problem of, you know, dementia and Alzheimer's that is going to be a huge, I mean, if you believe the statistics that they threw out, it was going to take something like 3 to 4 points off of global GDP in the next, was it 20 or 30 years? Some extraordinary number that we're all going to have to deal with. So you could either say, oh my gosh, the world's coming to an end, or you say, how do we think about addressing this? And it was a lot about how can the educational institutions that are delving deeply into research, combining that in a very creative way with the private sector to try to study this problem and, you know, come up with some solutions.
Okay, so great. Let me follow up on that. What was the one in Scotland? Silicon Glen, and we have the one outside Cambridge, Silicon Fens,
yes.
and we have everything else. So you were in our board meeting this afternoon where somebody was quoting Angela Merkel saying that you know that Germany. It's great that Germany makes BMW and Mercedes, but they need to be the home of the next Apple. How do you think about the innovativeness of the European economy, and does the sort of the Silicon Valley mindset need to become more important here, or is the sort of German tailored high-end manufacturing still the value add for this part of the world?
Well, I can tell you from a UK point of view, and I do a lot of tech IPOs globally, the firm does, Credit Suisse, having done Alibaba and, you know, 11 or 15 of the last year's Chinese IPOs. I'm encouraged probably for the first time in years about the number of really interesting tech businesses that I'm coming across in the UK. Now, this is after 5 years or 7 years of investment in the concepts of Tech City and what's going on in the Shoreditch area and what have you. The kinds of real business plans that I'm seeing that I think are actually financeable and IPOable are pretty extraordinary. And so we're just on the verge of that, and I think some of the halo effect of, you know, the go-go tech sector in the States, Silicon Valley based, is encouraging and fostering that enthusiasm, and the government's definitely encouraging it. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that it's starting to filter down into, you know, the younger generation.
So
Tony,
do you think it needs to happen or will happen in a place like Germany, or is it likely to happen in the Anglo part of Europe?
Well, I was going to ask the question. I imagine 90% of what you're saying or thereabouts is probably here.
Well, I took the first large-scale e-commerce company public is called Zalando in Germany, right? That was, and that's a $5 billion valuation company, which, you know, that was the first sort of real e-commerce company in Europe was in Germany. So if that's just one small microcosm example of the sort of innovation that's happening, I'm pretty encouraged. But I will tell you a little story that when I moved to the UK, I had a very dear friend whose child went to school in the UK system up until sort of age 11, and then they moved back to the States. And when their child was in the first classroom environment in the US, the teacher said, I want you to do a book report and express yourself however you want. And it could be paper mache or a play or a song or whatever you want to do. And the child was absolutely frozen. In the UK school system, if you were going to write a book report, the instruction would have been, I want 250 words, it better be perfect penmanship and in the lines, and that's what mattered much more than the creativity. So I think there has to be a shift, and there is starting to be a shift in the education system, because it starts young. If you're fostering and you're promoting something that's creative and not very sort of box-driven, I think that's one of the indicators of how you can start to a generation later have some of what we're seeing.
Tony, if you look at Germany and look at sort of how things have gone macro in Europe in the last 5 years, so Germany's done well, German exports have done well, but is that because of insatiable Chinese demand, because the euro's been driven down by Greece, or is it because there's actually some global competitiveness in the German and the North European economy, certainly?
I think it's all three. I mean, I think clearly sort of in the heavy equipment sector, they compete very favorably. So China and emerging market growth has been terrific for them. Clearly, the euro is much lower than it would be if it was just Germany. So that's helped them. But we've owned a couple businesses in Germany, great engineers, very technically competent, innovative kinds of things that they're doing. I haven't been involved in the tech sector, but I would say in the manufacturing sector, what we see them doing is state of the art.